It's a bit reddish. It's okay. We can see it.
Turn on the actual presentation and see if it's still red. Oh, no, we are not about to mess with anything here. And let me actually...
So we're going to go for the next session, which is going to be Stephen Walli from the Office of CTO and working at Microsoft.
Thanks, everybody, for your time this afternoon. So my name is Steve Walli. I work in the Azure Office of the CTO. I'm not here to talk about things as a Microsoft employee particularly because, sorry, I have to get rid of the old man glasses too. I've been around the open source community for the better part of almost 30 years now. And I've had lots of opportunity to do lots of things from different perspectives. So I've built products, and I've serviced products, and I've worked as the technical director for an open source foundation, and I've consulted to lots of small companies. The value capture question in the last talk was actually a really important one. And I'm going to present kind of a couple of frameworks. These are tools that I typically use to help people think their way through, gosh, this open source stuff is different. I hope it dovetails nicely with what Jeffrey was saying, because he and I have been around this space long enough, and we kind of see similar patterns. And I'm trying to give folks a language and a framework they can use as they start to analyze the situation in front of them. The most fundamental thing, though, that I believe is open source software is about engineering economics. There's a fundamental reason we have to do this at all times. And I also believe that there's not an open source business model. And I'm going to hopefully give you a couple of ways to think about that as you analyze all these opportunities in front of you. What I'm really saying, though, is it's collaboratively developed, liberally licensed software. It's all about the engineering economics here. And I say it that way because we've actually been sharing software since we've been writing software. And we do that because writing good software is hard work. And I can bore you with stories that go literally back to 1950 with the first programmable computer in America. That was Princeton University in the Institute of Advanced Studies, and this was von Neumann's work. And there was two sets of people working on that computer, and they were starting to share software already. There was literally a day shift and a night shift working on completely different projects, and they started sharing that far back. And it gets kind of interesting. We started drifting into this space. I started work in 1980. I have that much gray hair. And that was the year that the US Congress adds computer software under copyright law. And so what happens is we end up experimenting for almost 20 years with lots of different licensing to continue to share and collaborate the way we've been sharing and collaborating for the previous 30 years. And at the end of that, we end up with the open source definition, and we've had that for 20 years, and that has served us very well. There are stresses that are going to come and arguments that are going to happen, but this definition works pretty well for us. It actually kind of lays that foundation of how you should think about licenses that encourage a particular kind of collaboration. So that's where I talk about collaboratively developed, liberally licensed software is about engineering economics. So here's a case from my own personal history. In the 90s, I had a startup, and we were building the Unix space on Windows NT. And for anybody under the age of 30, Unix was a big thing. And our product was called Interix. It eventually became Services for Unix at Microsoft, and from there it became the subsystem for Unix applications. I would like to point out it is not the current thing. People are very excited right now. Did you know I can run a Unix shell on Windows? Yes, we were doing it 20 years ago. But Interix was a separate company. I had a Microsoft license for a piece of the kernel. And I started wrapping 250 to 300 pieces of software, interesting buckets of technology off the internet around it. And those things, I mean, this was that period. This was before we called things open source. So it was this period of licensing experimentation. So these 250 to 300 things were covered by about 25 to 30 licenses, some of which still don't meet the open source definition. But we hit a point where we needed control of our own tool chain. And in gaining control of our own tool chain, that meant we needed to use another compiler. So we'd been using the Microsoft compiler up till then. And the thing you have to remember in the early days of Windows NT, it ran on 3 computer architectures. It wasn't just Intel. It ran on DEC Alpha and PowerPC as well. And so I couldn't just swap out a compiler from Microsoft without somehow solving this for multiple different architectures. You know, Intel had a fantastic, they probably had the best C compiler from a performance perspective in that day. This is about 97 time frame. But I still have 2 other architectures I have to support. And it's not necessarily going to solve all of my problems. So I'm the engineering manager. I run R&D. I hire a really competent compiler developer. And we started with GCC. Because GCC wasn't the best compiler in 1997, but it was a really good compiler. And so starting with GCC and a really competent compiler developer, we proceeded to rebuild the GCC world to run in our specific architecture across the 3 physical architectures that Windows NT ran on. And so we, for about $100,000, I now have time to market that I didn't have to try and write a compiler, because that would have been a very bad use of my 25 development staff. And the thing is, when you do the calculation for the actual value capture, GCC was about 750,000 lines of code at that point. Now, I used to develop code for a living. I hate lines of code as much as every developer in this room hates lines of code as a measure. I get it. But it's an interesting relative measure. And if you do the Kokomo calculation in 1997 dollars, that's about $10 million in value. And I've spent 100,000. So as an engineering manager, as a product manager, I'm ecstatic. This is 2 orders of magnitude of value capture. But I'm now living on a brittle fork. You see, and it's not just because we didn't know what we were doing. We were active in a number of different open source communities at the time. I had one developer that was actually actively supporting one of the Berkeley projects, things like that. But we're living on a fork, and what you'd quickly discover with GCC is under the GCC umbrella, there's actually 5 open source projects, 5 different communities with very different flavors of kind of society within them. And some of them looked at our stuff and loved it. I had this dramatically experienced compiler developer. They loved their changes. Others, you are working on that Microsoft crap and we want nothing to do with you. Like, that was the level of technical discourse about our change set. And we needed to make these changes across all 5. So, again, from the era of open source I grew up in, I went out and I called Cygnus Solutions, because Cygnus Solutions was the preeminent GCC compiler developers of the day that had most of the committers on staff. And I said, I have this problem. And they said, we're really busy right now, but we could start in 14 months, and it'll cost you $120,000. I was a startup. It was still a lot of money for us, but it was the 14-month gap that also scared us. I'm betting the price they quoted us was nothing more than that's what they quote every chip vendor when they ask for a GCC port. But there was another company out there called Ada Core Technology, ACT. And ACT also had committers on staff. And they could start next month, and they were only going to charge me $40,000. So at this point, I've now spent $140,000. I'm now living at head rev. All of our stuff has gone back upstream. And so this is a little bit different. This is a difference. And my experience with it, it's just a difference in my experience. Everything that Jeffrey said about upstream first is an important thing to take home with you in your heart. That is the rule you should live by. But understand there's also times when you're building product that you might not be able to, depending on the product environment you're living in. So I was very much a consume and return kind of person. Catch and release, does that work? Yeah, it's like... but the interesting thing for us was GCC wasn't standing still over that year and a half. GCC was now 1.2 million lines of code. That was this extra value that had been hauled in there. And it's not a matter of I've spent 140. We now think that every major release that they roll out from GCC, we're probably down to more of a month's worth of integration costs. So we're probably down in, kind of the $10,000 space. So I'm now at 3 orders of magnitude of value capture. So this, as a consumer of open source software, this is kind of one of the cleanest examples that I can offer up from personal experience, where the numbers work really, really, really well. And what it is, though, is that the simple way to frame this discussion in your head, because everybody that works with software in here, everybody that's a manager of a software team or writes software for a living, all the way up through to the CIO, if we have any departmental CIOs in here, is we all understand the build versus buy. We've been doing that since we've had computing. Like, do I hire more staff and do we build it ourselves, or do I buy something from a vendor and risk the lock-in problems that happens? We all understand the build versus buy equation. And what you get with open source is you get borrow and share. You've got this whole new way to think about how can you rapidly leverage in a build kind of way, something that you don't have to buy anymore. Now, I'm going to change this for you in just a minute. I'm afraid I'm going to move the goalposts on you. But there's a whole class of computing problems that you can apply this kind of thinking to, that it becomes build versus buy versus borrow and share. So that's a really useful thing. And so that's why I keep coming back. Open source software is about engineering economics. That to me, in a pure consumption model, is the cleanest way I can talk about it. Because anybody else that wants to talk about anything else in that space, it starts to get messy. It starts to get religious. You start to have people arguing different business models at you. And remember, I'm the guy that keeps saying there is no open source business model. So let's talk about the business side of the equation for a bit. And the way I'm trying, this is the first time I've tried this model, so bear with me. But I normally do this talking to product people, trying to help them think their way through these kinds of problems. And so the number one thing you have to understand as you step into the open source world is projects are not products. And this is something that is just fundamental to this space. And this is the biggest mistake that everybody makes if they're going to make a mistake, is they confuse these two things. And I don't mean little companies with too much VC money. I mean, I worked for Hewlett-Packard for a couple of years inside of the cloud business unit in time to watch it explode. And I don't mean in a good way. And in that explosion and that collapse of that business unit, they spent hundreds of millions of dollars failing on OpenStack because they didn't understand the dynamic and they did not understand this rule. So this is a really important rule to get right. So projects, that's these interesting buckets of technology, collaboratively built, like-minded engineers. This is what projects are all about. What was that wonderful quote from the keynote this morning? Was that open source is collaboratively built social engagement or something like that. It was such a perfect quote at the time. Products solve customer problems for money. It's a value proposition. So this is where it starts. These are two different discussions that people are going to have with you. When the Red Hat account manager comes to you, they aren't talking to you about open source. They're talking to you about RHEL and solving your problems with RHEL and working with you in a product way as your trusted vendor of open source. Projects have communities. And the great dichotomy, the great splitting line that I've seen in this space, and it's not perfectly true, but it's close enough that it'll get you a long way, is communities have time and no money. Products have customers. Customers have money and no time. Customers want something now. They want a solution, they want it to work, they want value for money. And so you end up in this bucket where, community versus customer. Communities really are looking at this idea of, I want to solve my problem in community using the project. I care about agency to solve my problem. I'm not here to build software for you in the community. I'm here to solve my problems and contribute back. That contributing back is always important because you never want to live on a brittle fork. Customers, they want to buy a solution. I need a product. I need my problem solved now. And I'm going to do a value analysis of, are you giving me good value for money? The reason I highlight these three bullets down here, like I said, I often talk to people that are trying to build open source related companies. And producing your own open source, as opposed to consuming it the way I was doing with that GCC compiler example, still has enormous value for you as a company. To answer your question from earlier, that's a little bit different. If you're running a software company, you have to run a software company. And if your core competency is producing software in a particular problem domain, parking an open source license on your core value proposition might not be a good idea. And there's lots of business rationale as to why that exists. And no amount of open source discussion will change the reality of how you have to run a company. So that doesn't mean that a company that can't produce lots and lots and lots of open source, but the way you do that is you produce it in the complement value spaces around your core value proposition, if software is what you do for a living. Or you can even do it in context spaces. My favorite example out there is Spinnaker from Netflix. Spinnaker is a fabulous CI/CD pipeline, and it is pure context to Netflix. At no time does it have any read on the core value proposition of Netflix, delivering entertainment streamed live to multiple devices in your life. And it doesn't even read in the complement spaces around how might I do that better, faster, make something stickier on that core value proposition. CI/CD pipeline software is completely out of band for them. But releasing it as open source is still hugely valuable because it actually validates that this tool chain they've built is important and good because lots of people are using it. They also use it as a recruiting tool to demonstrate that they actually know how to do interesting engineering problems, solve interesting engineering problems, and they've done nothing but have good times with it. How am I doing for time? Ooh, I'll make it. So going back to the build versus buy versus borrow and share, if you step into this space of projects versus products, if we start to split it apart, you're really like build versus buy versus doing something with a project and community. And from there, it's really like, so it's build it yourself, or I'm buying a product, or I'm part of that project over there. And so when you actually take a look at that, you step into this space where you can start to, as consumers of stuff that people are going to throw open source words at you, you can start to look at it, which bucket does this fit in for me? Am I buying RHEL? I still get called into customer situations where we need open source support. And you say, well, what's the customer trying to do? And, well, they buy RHEL. Okay, so that's not an open source discussion. The customer is clearly buying a product from one of our valued partners. That's great. But you don't need somebody to come in and explain open source to the customer because the customer doesn't care at that moment. And it doesn't mean that that customer isn't savvy enough that they're also happily using CentOS on their dev and test machines because they don't want to pay RHEL for everything. So you end up in this space, though, where Kubernetes is another one of the fun examples that I love. I have been in a room of Kubernetes engineers, some of them from Google, and the Google engineers have been insistent with me that Kubernetes is the product. And then the next sentence out of their mouth is the magic one. 5 days after a project release, it's up and running in production. So what happens in that 5 days? Well, they plumb in a whole lot of very Google hardware-specific drivers for networking and storage. They wrap an entire billing system that's highly proprietary around it. There's a whole lot of things that happen to Kubernetes, the project, to turn it into GKE, the product that is customer-facing with a value proposition that solves customer problems. At Microsoft, it takes us 10 days to get to AKS because we don't have the privilege of already testing it in their own live environment before they do the project release, which is very frustrating for me. But as you walk your way through the list, that's the kind of thing you need to kind of separate for yourself is in this discussion, I know I'm doing an open source, I know I care about open source, and open source in today's world has become a shorthand for a lot of managers making decisions around vendor lock-in in the same way we used to talk about open systems and standards in the 90s. And it is absolutely a hedge. And it's a good hedge. So there's nothing wrong with thinking about it that way. But understand that the second you bought RHEL, you're probably not going to swap it out for Debian or even SUSE, because the whole management structure of that is different. And not only that, you're probably just not going to perturb, like how much will it cost you to perturb your RHEL working environment to flip to a different Linux base? So none of this stuff is cost-free, but there is at least an argument you can still have with your Red Hat account executive about exactly how unhappy you might be and that you might move to SUSE. So it's absolutely a hedge. But just keep clear, am I buying a product, or are we talking about using a project, or are we talking about contributing and creating our own project community? So this is where I keep coming back to it. This is why it's engineering economics. There isn't an open source business model. And just to kind of drive that point home, I've got the last couple of things to try and continue to provoke that thinking. I love Red Hat. And I don't mean that as, I work for Microsoft and they're a valued partner. No, I have loved Red Hat from the day Bob Young started the company. And they have been focused all the way back to the Bob Young days. These are the three CEOs. I give one of the many little talks that I give a talk about Red Hat as a talk about three CEOs making critical decisions in three different markets that are always customer focused. And I never talk about open source. Now this upsets the Red Hat engineers terribly, but at the end of the day, Red Hat is this phenomenally successful enterprise software company. And where I try and go with that is they hit a pivot point. And the pivot point for them, this is the stock price down along here. So they go public in '99, the stock soars, the internet bubble bursts, the stock crashes. And in that kind of rumbling around down here, Matthew Zulik realizes Red Hat Linux, which was the distro that you used to pull out of the back of the book, because we cared about books back then. I have known people running major server sites on that CD at one time. But Zulik realizes that we have a whole lot of customers on Wall Street that are racking up Red Hat Linux out of the back of books on cheap Intel servers. And he pivots the company. Bob used to run it as a branding exercise. When you think Linux, the next words in your head need to be Red Hat. And what Matthew does is he pivots. So he's no longer about being this preeminent Linux distro. RHEL was cheap Unix on Intel. They burned their way through the Unix ISV market and captured all those Unix ISVs over to RHEL. They rebranded. They were surprised to discover they still needed a community in Fedora, and they quickly assembled that together over that next year. And they've executed a phenomenal game. But the problem they're parked on is cheap Unix on Intel. Because your alternative in those days was, well, we could spend a lot of money on Solaris on Spark. So this is why to me, it's a really valuable example, because you have to look at Red Hat for what it is and not what people want to believe it is. Last couple of slides here is just useful things to think about if you're going to think about open source from a business perspective, and why I keep trying to hammer home this idea that it's not a business model. This man is Geoffrey Moore. He was the guy that in 1991 articulated Crossing the Chasm and the technology adoption life cycle. Both Crossing the Chasm and Dealing with Darwin give you that way to talk about things as core value proposition versus complement value add, or core competency versus context. And that's a different core. Core competency is really the thing that you do that enables your core value proposition to your customer. And so using those kinds of, that kind of language across those couple of books, you actually get into a space where you start realizing exactly what you're analyzing when you're looking at the business. Now I realize, working in government, you have less of a critical need to do this kind of thing. But that's where most of my thinking came from in that space. And the other person is, that's Clayton Christensen. He's the guy that in '97, I think it was, did the Innovator's Dilemma and talked about disruptive business models. And The Innovator's Solution was the book that came on the heels of that. And in there, that's the one where, like I said, you have to be really careful if you're going to take your core value proposition and slap an open source license on it in the hopes that you're going to somehow create all of these early adopters. You know, what you're often doing is you're getting a whole lot of early adopters in community that aren't giving you the feedback loop that you need as a business because they aren't early adopter customers. And that's a really hard thing. We've seen situations, OpenStack is a classic there. 31 seconds to go. OpenStack was the classic. They keep talking about the same 5 marquee users. And it tends to be CERN, BMW, Walmart, and I can't remember who the other 2 big ones are right now. And the thing is, those are end users that are spending the money inside the IT organization to become experts in this open source community and to participate as equals in that community. They aren't buying anything from a vendor. And so that's kind of an interesting game there. And so that's the kind of thinking I would encourage you to start to apply to your own problems as you step into this space. And with that, I'm done.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry that we don't have time for questions, but Stephen is hanging around. He's right out here. So if you have questions for him, please come by.